All right, let's jump right in. We're tackling a huge, and I mean huge, question today, one that gets right to the heart of religious history, the origins of Islam. Now, this is a topic that's wrapped up in faith, culture, and, let's be honest, centuries of really intense debate. So let's unpack it all together.
So let's get right to the heart of it. The whole controversy really hangs on this one pretty provocative question. You hear it all the time from critics. Are the most sacred rituals in Islam actually just recycled pagan traditions? This is the central claim, so it's the perfect place for us to start. Okay, so to really get our heads around this, we've got to start with one side of the story. Let's dive into the case for pagan roots. To get the complete picture, we need to seriously examine the claims made by people who see a straight line connecting the ancient pagan world to the Islam we know today. So, claim number one. This is a big one you hear a lot. The idea is that the name Allah wasn't some new name for God. Nope. The argument goes that he was actually a well-known deity from the old Arab pantheon, specifically a moon god. And people who believe this often point to the crescent moon symbol you see all over the Muslim world as, the smoking gun.
All right, claim number two takes us to the Hajj, the massive annual pilgrimage to Mecca. Critics look at these incredible rituals, right? Circling the Kaaba 7 times, touching or kissing the black stone, and they say, hold on a second, this looks familiar. The argument is that these aren't uniquely Islamic rites at all, but are basically carbon copies of what Arab pagans were doing in that exact same spot for centuries.
And then we get to something really controversial, the story known as the Satanic Verses. Now, this is a tricky one. According to some very early historical accounts, there was this one moment, a brief instant, where the Prophet Muhammad might have temporarily acknowledged 3 local pagan goddesses as worthy of veneration. And for critics, this is huge. It looks like a clear sign of compromise with the old pagan ways.
And finally, the fourth big claim kind of zooms out a bit. It's not just about paganism. People point to things like the 5 daily prayers and say, hey, that looks a lot like what Zoroastrians were doing. So the idea here is that maybe these key Islamic practices weren't uniquely revealed from on high, but were just, borrowed from the neighbors. Okay, so that's the case for pagan origins. It sounds pretty compelling when you lay it all out like that, right? But that's only half the story. Now let's flip the coin and see what the historical evidence and modern scholars have to say. And trust me, it paints a very different picture.
First off, let's go right back to that moon god theory. The bottom line from pretty much all serious modern historians, it just doesn't hold water. They say it's pure speculation because there's really no solid evidence, no inscriptions, no archaeology to back it up. And that crescent moon symbol, turns out that was adopted way later, centuries later in fact. It's more of a cultural thing, like a flag, not some ancient religious relic. So to really get what was going on before Islam, you need to understand this really important concept called henotheism. It's not straight up polytheism where all gods are on the same level. Think of it more like having a CEO. Many pre-Islamic Arabs already believed in a top dog, a supreme creator god, and guess what? They called him Allah. But they also worshipped a whole bunch of lesser gods and goddesses, kind of like divine middlemen, to get their messages to the big God. And you don't even have to take my word for it. The Quran itself calls them out on this exact worldview. This verse here basically says, yeah, we know you worship these other guys only to get closer to Allah. So the concept of Allah as the supreme God was already there. The big change, the absolute revolution of Islam, wasn't the name. It was getting rid of all those intermediaries. Now, back to that Satanic Verses story. This is where things get really complicated, and honestly, scholarly opinion is divided. On one side, you have many Islamic scholars who say, no way this happened. They look at the historical chains, who told the story to whom, and they find them super weak and unreliable. But on the other hand, you have different scholars who say, well, maybe it did happen, and was later scrubbed from the record to protect the theological idea that the prophet could never make a mistake. Okay, so what about those similarities with other religions, like Zoroastrianism or Judaism? Well, here's the thing historians always remind us of. No religion is an island. The ancient Near East was like a massive, bustling marketplace of ideas. So when you see shared practices, it's often a sign of cultural diffusion, ideas just being in the air, shared and adapted by everyone in the neighborhood. It's less about direct copying and more about living in the same intellectual world. And this right here, this brings us to the absolute core of the scholarly response. The main idea isn't that Islam invented everything from scratch. Of course not. The real genius, the real revolution, was in the process of radical transformation.
Just look at this. It's like taking an old bottle and filling it with something completely new and different. You have a pilgrimage that people were already doing, but instead of honoring hundreds of idols, boom, it's now for the one God. You have animal sacrifice, but instead of being for some local tribal god, it's now a powerful symbol of Abraham's devotion. The outer action, the form, might look similar, but the inner meaning, the why, is turned completely on its head.
It's so systematic, you can almost break it down into a 4-step playbook. Step 1, find a practice everyone's already doing. Step 2, get out the theological scrub brush and remove every last trace of idolatry. Step 3, re-aim the whole thing, laser-focused on the worship of the one God, that's the core concept of Tawhid. And finally, step 4, give it a brand new, deeper spiritual and ethical purpose. And make no mistake, this was not some subtle behind-the-scenes thing. It was a full frontal theological assault on the old beliefs. I mean, look at this verse from the Quran. It literally calls out the 3 main goddesses of Mecca by name, Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, and just dismisses them. It says they're not but names, just labels that people made up. That is a direct public takedown of the entire pagan system. And this whole process of reform wasn't just about words and ideas. It had a physical, dramatic climax. The year is 630 CE. The Prophet Muhammad and his followers enter Mecca. They go straight to the Kaaba, the center of the old worship, and they physically smash and remove every single one of the idols inside. Talk about a powerful statement. It was a literal, physical cleansing of the house. Okay, so we've heard the claims from the critics, and we've heard the counterarguments from historians and theologians. After all that, where does the weight of the evidence actually lead us? What's the final verdict here? Let's just do a quick side-by-side recap to make it super clear. The Allah was a moon god idea, pretty much debunked by modern scholars. The crescent is a later cultural icon. The Hajj-looking pagan, the argument is it was redefined and purified, not copied. The satanic verses, a historically contested story with weak chains of transmission. And borrowing other practices, that's seen as just normal cultural overlap, not some kind of pagan inheritance. And this, right here, is probably the single most important point to take away from our whole explainer today. We have to separate the form of a ritual, what it looks like on the outside, from its meaning, its inner theology. You know, walking around a building is just walking around a building. But the difference between doing it to honor 360 idols versus doing it to worship one single invisible God, well, that's not just a small tweak. That is a universe of difference. So, the modern scholarly consensus isn't that Islam simply inherited paganism. Far from it. The view is that Islam actively engaged with the culture of its time, taking existing practices and radically reforming and adapting them to fit a new, strictly monotheistic worldview. So it wasn't a copy-paste job, it was a revolution from within. Which leaves us with one last fascinating question to chew on, and this goes way beyond just Islam. How much can you change a ritual, a tradition, before it stops being the old thing and becomes something completely new? At what point does the reinterpretation become so total that the old practice is essentially gone and a new one has taken its place? It's a really deep question about the very nature of continuity and change throughout all of human history.